Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hey, when you guys joined, did you get a password needed?
No, it just asked me to log in.
Yeah.
For a secret handshake.
Wait just a sec. Some of the people that are going to be coming today were just at the TOC meeting that ended 10 seconds ago. While we wait, feel free to sign in to the doc. This will wait till 5 past. We're waiting for Lee. He just dropped offline for some reason.
Hello. Hey guys. Hey, I'm back.
Oh, hey. So we'll wait for one more minute. You probably joined just after I sent the thing. So here is, okay, here's the link to the actual doc. So if you have any slides, you can link them there, or we'll take notes here. All right, well, I guess we'll just get started here in another 30 seconds. Reaching out to people on Slack really fast that pretty sure we're coming.
Matt, I just hosed my environment. If there's any way, if there's any other agenda before mine, that would be.
Yeah, no problem. We can skip that and come back to it. We've got some stuff we can do beforehand. It's no big deal at all.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it's 5 past. I guess we'll the rest will get here when they get here. So welcome everyone. This is the first meeting for tag observability in April. This is a CNCF sponsored event, so the code of conduct does apply. Please don't put anything in chat or do or say anything that would be in violation of that code. Right, so sign in if you haven't already. we'll cover some admin bits and some other things prior, and we'll come back to Meshery. So first, for admin bits, there's been Alalita and I and some others were talking about when we meet, and there was a suggestion that we move to sort of every other meeting being sometime around now, which is really good for the West Coast of the US, the East Coast of the US, or North America rather, as well as Central Europe. However, it's really not good for the other time zones. So does anyone have strong feelings about this, or should we just do this on the mailing list with the doodle? About flip-flopping meetings, every other meeting, one, because we have people that don't want to join in the middle of the night and things like that.
I think doing something on the meeting list makes sense. Sorry, on the mailing list.
Cool. Okay. So we'll do that on the list. Secondly, there's a really old issue number 37 for our logo. That's just been sort of lingering. But in talking with the CNCF folks that have been working on logos for all of the other tags, they all seem to be animal based. And so, there were successive rounds of ideas around that. And folks seem to like the owl. I kind of like an owl as a mascot as well versus some of the other choices. Does anyone want to write up something about owls and how they might be applicable? I'm kind of a nerd for animals and birds and things, so it could all be in my head. But owls are wise. They're, there's allusions to Heisenberg and things like that. They fly softly. They hear all the things. They see all the things, and they interact with their ecosystems in very targeted ways. Does anyone feel like writing up? But I'll just say there's an opportunity, if anyone's interested, reach out to write up something about owls.
I can do that.
Okay.
I'm a big bird fan.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. Reach out after, we can sync up, or you could just comment in on issue number 37, and we can come back to it next time. We'll skip Lee until he gets his environment up and stuff. Gods are never kind. It's a law of nature, I think. Ken, do you want to give a brief update on Observe K8s and where we're at with that?
Sure. So we had our first meeting last week. There was only 4 of us, so definitely, if anyone is interested in joining, please do so. We've shifted the meeting times for this week going forward. It'll now be this time slot on a Thursday, so 12 to 1 Eastern on a Thursday. We may over time have to do something similar to the tag in terms of multiple times and alternating weeks for different time zones, but for now it's 12 to 1 Eastern on Thursdays. So far we've just started laying out some draft issues for the group to work through, and we discussed last week some various approaches. The current thinking, and we certainly love feedback on this, is to just start with a basic observability stack of Prometheus, Jaeger, Loki, or whatever it might be, just to get those telemetry signals from a bare system on Kube running, and get that piece of infrastructure laid down, and then focus on instrumenting demo applications to provide more application level information into that observability rather than just the stack itself. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. Any questions or comments from anyone?
I'm just searching for the link to the meeting because I'm interested to be part of that for sure.
Yeah, so the meeting should be in the CNCF calendar.
Okay.
It should, I think there's also, I think Matt, you added a
Just dropped a link to it directly in the doc.
I was just say, I think there was a tick or talk link or something in the Observe K8's chat as well as Slack. So yeah, there is a Slack channel as well. Please come by and give us your thoughts. Yeah, looking to have as many people that are interested to come help out.
Cool. Yeah, I put a link in
Right, that's it. Yeah.
the chat as well as the meeting notes. But yeah, it's official if it's in the CNCF calendar. There's also the Slack group that Ken mentioned. I believe is WG Observe Case.
Yes.
Definitely reach out there. It's exciting to see it become sort of pseudo official versus just something we talk about. It's something that we're now going to start to do. So thanks, Ken.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt.
Hendrik's here, right?
Yep.
Oh, hey, there.
I'm here. Yeah. Yeah. So we started an initiative. For the moment, it's like a pure pilot. There is nothing really ongoing on the CNCF YouTube channel, but we want to create open source or open observability, I would say, but we extend it to open source in general because there are other projects in CNCF not really dedicated to observability, but the idea is to give continuous update to the market and to increase adoptions on various projects. So we started a first pilot a few weeks back, and we are going to record another one in 2 days. The idea we're improving the process, and again, the idea is to deliver a video about 10 to 15 minutes max, with 5 minutes of news, presenting a few new projects, what's the value of that, sharing some links. And then we pick one of the topics from one weekly news and we discuss with Michael from Amazon, Observable. And then we finish with, I'm starting to design like a weather forecast dedicated to open telemetry. And the idea is to keep track on the various project libraries, which version, how stable they are, any news related to the project, so people can basically follow what's going on and which version they should pick if they want to get started in terms of compatibility and so on. And again, the idea is at the moment we are piloting. So if you want to contribute, again, we don't want to be 10 because otherwise we're very difficult to manage the recording and post-production. It is but if you want to contribute on the content, and if you want to share news, because at the moment we are mainly going after news and searching for each project. So if you have news to share, or if you have anything that makes sense to be presented, feel free to send it over to me or Michael Azenblas, so we can add it to one of the news of the week. And also, if there's any, at the end of the show, we try to identify a few either books or blogs that will be relevant for the community. So if there are relevant blogs that make sense, you can share it as well. I already selected a few of them, but again, if you think there is something that makes sense to be shared for the community, let us know, so then we can add it to the storyboard and the content of the open source news. So as of now, the news is only going on my YouTube channel, but it's just for the piloting phase, just to improve, to see how we want to structure the show and the workflow. And once we are sort of mature, we want to basically broadcast directly to the CNCF YouTube channel. Any questions?
Sounds really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pretty excited. I just dropped a link to the Is It Observable channel that Hendrik mentioned. And Hendrik, just so I don't have to do it live here, if you could drop a link to the pilot.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure people would be interested to see it.
So the pilot will change, to be honest, because we did it live. But I think this is not a content for live streaming, so we could we will probably do post-production. So at the end, this will change soon with the idea is to replicate the experience of a TV news, old style TV news. So that's so with the live nature, it was difficult to make it, to have that experience. So we're gonna change and do post-production instead. So record and then put all the background and so on. So then it feels like a TV show.
Is that sort of post-production work something that you plan to do, or something that you're asking for contribution or help or collaboration for? In other words, is that an ask or an inform?
So at the moment, I'm going to do it. But again, if there are people who wants to just be part of the project, they like to do post-production, and the idea is we can collaborate on this one. I mean, I already have some stuff on my plate, so it could be great to share of course, the work. But again, I'm used to do a lot of post-production. So if you are not used to that, then I can do it. But again, if you want to contribute, I will be more than happy to onboard you in the small team.
Yeah, and I'll just say a general plug. If anyone has their ear to the ground or has leads for interesting stories or news, for example, Hendrik and I were talking briefly over Slack a couple of days ago around, I think you had mentioned something about what's going on with OpenTelemetry, right? What's coming, or what OpenTelemetry is such a huge umbrella of projects that, ferreting out what's interesting or what's new is itself could be a full-time job, right? So if there are noteworthy news bites, please send them Hendrik's way, and he can use that as part of the roadmap and or source material.
One thing is, at the moment, the weather forecast that I'm going to design. So at the moment, I will do the weather forecast for sure. But if someone feels to put yourself in front of a camera with a green screen and make it fun, feel free. Otherwise, I will do it. But I have Michael, who's the special reporter, so we make a discussion. And then there is the weather forecasts section that could be presented by someone else. So if someone will be part of that part, you're more than welcome.
Absolutely. I'm happy to bang a drum here too as well. I think it's been something I've kind of repeated a bunch over the last year, but ever since we got the YouTube channel and just the go ahead from the CNCF and support, to produce content such as what Hendrik's doing, the one sort of prime directive, to borrow Star Trekism, is really to be creative and be fun. There's you can, so what Hendrik's doing here, I think, is awesome because it's catchy and it's novel, and it's not just another blog post or not just another info dump of things that are happening, but he's actually making it engaging and making it stick out from the rest, if you will. So we were kind of asked specifically to unleash the creative forces that we have in the tag around this. So if anybody does have a passion for this sort of video format, or just the overall concept of informing the community or finding interesting things, please reach out to Hendrik. I'm going to make a very brief plug. I'm almost done with this book, which is Understanding Software Dynamics. It's wonderful. It's sort of bringing back old, I don't want to say old ideas, but ideas that were used up to 20 years ago. In my case, in the embedded system space. I think it's sort of a new signal, which is why I mention it here. Unlike profiling, which is sort of, well, I'll just say in a nutshell, the core idea that he's implemented here and elaborates on and has, working for the Linux kernel through a series of patches is a thing called KU trace. And in a nutshell, what it does, I'm not going to go into crazy detail because it's deep, but every time a thread is woken up by the scheduler, by the Linux kernel's scheduler, it records at that point why it woke up. So threads typically run until they are waiting on something, whether it's an IO or a lock or some other waitable resource. So what this profiling approach does is sort of build something analogous to a distributed trace, but this is all, way down inside the kernel. And so you get a look at every time a thread wakes up, why did it wake up with a relationship, an arc back to the thing it was waiting on. And unlike profiling that can just look at one process oftentimes or something like that, you get a holistic view of all of the interrupts, all of the threads, not just one process, but on the whole system and their interactions. And so this is a really rich source of data that can help us really understand what's going on. Like, why did this code run a little bit slower? It could have nothing to do with that code. Something else could be slamming, IO on the underlying node, a completely unrelated workload, but that's having an impact. In addition, it does a very good job, this approach of recording explicitly when nothing's happening, right? Like everything is running slow, but when you go in there and look at what's going on, perhaps everything is basically waiting and sleeping all of the time. So, the system is running slow and nothing's happening on the CPU. And the next step is, well, why? What are those things asleep waiting for? This sort of signal data can get it there. So I'll just leave it there and just say I highly recommend you give it a look. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about it in the future, but I do consider it sort of a new signal type, and in thinking through what the implications are for OTel and other things. I'm still mulling, but just wanted to give a plug if there's any bookworms out there that want to check it out. Any questions or comments, or has anyone else looked at this book as well?
I haven't yet, but it looks interesting. So I'm going to try and find it.
Cool. Lee, do you need another couple minutes, or are you good to go? I have sort of one other thing prepped to briefly cover, but if you're ready now, you could.
I'll take the one other thing. I'm recompiling an item.
Okay, sure. So the last thing is, gosh, back in 2021, May, I think, May 2021, when we were doing some population of issues, that the tag might work on, one of them was pretty basic. It sounded basic, like just for the observability slice of the CNCF landscape. Who are the players? Who are the vendors? Who are the projects? And what are the trends? And how do we think about it? So that issue just kind of sat there for a while, and then last fall at KubeCon in LA, I went to Dawn Foster's talk. Dawn works in the open source program office at VMware, and she is a researcher and now is a director of a group there, focusing on open source communities and cultivating them, quantifying them, fostering them, etc. Her talk was called, I believe, Beyond GitHub Stars and Pull Requests, or something to that effect. And she went into, how do we assess the health of a project? How do we assess the health of a community? It's not just a popularity contest with stars, and much like quantifying the output of an engineering team, more pull requests or more code is not necessarily better, right? So the rabbit hole runs deep, but it kind of got me thinking, like, how do we assess our observability sector and all of the players in it and contributors in it. So we started looking. We started looking at other groups within the CNCF that are doing something similar. And about a month and a half ago or 2 months ago, Catherine Paganini from the Business Value Subcommittee, who is the group that has created the glossary.cncf.io, and other things like it. They have a goal of providing, in human speak, to business decision makers and other technology leaders, what do all these jargon terms mean, and how can we help normal humans understand some of our vocabulary and understand the ecosystem? And so, sort of under that banner, they had an ongoing effort. They had and still have an ongoing effort to kind of walk through the sector and help provide some clarity, like what's a vendor, what's a company, what does this mean, who contributes, basically to help illuminate sector by sector the very large landscape. So I engaged with them about a month and a half ago, And I dropped some initial notes in issue 41, and I created a new repo, and I'm launching a little project. If you can't see it, you'll be able to soon. It's an internal repo to the CNCF, but I won't go into great detail here, but the long and short of it is called landscape-graph. And in short, it's a graph data model of the landscape. The landscape we have now is very rectangular, if you will. It's a giant spreadsheet with a really cool app on top of it that if you know what you're looking for, you can go find information about any given product or CNCF member organization, companies, vendors, etc. However, if you don't know what you're looking for, if you want to understand the correlation between things like who contributed to these 3 projects and what else did they contribute to? Or another example might be for the CNCF sandbox for all projects in the observability domain, who are all the contributors to them in aggregate, who employs all of them, right? And who funded those employers, right? So you can look at like trends like that sound a lot like social networking, ad tech, FinOps, these kinds of things where graph databases for the last decade and a half have really revolutionized how we assess a community, social networking and the relationships between things. So what I've done is I've taken an initial whack at pulling the data model, which is a massive JSON file, into a Neo4j database so that can form a data model that can be then used by all manner of things, everything from some of the examples I just gave, like, assessing how is capital flowing, what's the correlation between GitHub stars and market cap, or you could take this same kind of data model and augment it with, and I've got a design for that, everything happening in Git. So for example, for all the projects that are in the observability sector of the landscape, what packages do they all bring in and what versions are they? And cross-reference that with all of the known CVEs. So we can say, like, we can provide to both the TOC and to the community an assessment of the CNCF's projects and build up an understanding of what dependencies they have that may or may not be safe or unsafe. So to answer these kinds of questions, a relational data model falls over pretty quickly, generally around 2 or 3 friends, if you will, or relationship hops. So that's in a nutshell some ongoing, very early work. And in the next few days, certainly by the end of the week, I would expect that repo hopefully to be public if you're not a CNCF TOC contributor or part of the CNCF organization on GitHub. If you want to see a brief preview, you can go to my GitHub and there's a landscape-graph, very, very rough early look at it. And if anyone's interested in this whole notion of sort of the intersection of observability and graph data science, please do reach out. I'd love to chat and contributors or more hands and brains would be wonderful on this. Do you have any questions or thoughts around that? Okay, with that, we are at the halfway point here, which is perfect. Lee, are you?
Yeah.
Cool. I haven't introduced you yet, so I can do that briefly. So Lee is the founder of a project called Meshery, which describes itself as the open source cloud native management plane that enables the adoption, operation, and management of Kubernetes, any service mesh, and the workloads. And as we know, service meshes are a huge source of signal data, and so I think it's pretty relevant. And when you see a little bit about what Meshery is, if you haven't seen it before, I think you'll be excited. So with that, take it away, Lee.
Yeah, well, I hope that you're excited. We'll see. There's maybe a couple of novel ideas in here about how to visually comprehend your infrastructure, your workloads. So just to add to Matt's background a little bit, to the extent that it's relevant here. So while my current full-time role is kind of focused toward Meshery toward a few other open source projects. My last full-time role was leading technology strategy for SolarWinds. And so observability is a real focus of mine. That was, let's not talk about the other SolarWinds incident. Let's not talk about SolarWinds making, I don't know, just uplifting the value of any security-oriented startup. But that was after my time. So anyway, so long-term service meshes, and they do what Matt was saying, which is, well, they can help take the blinders off a bit, and that's observability is, uniform observability is it's probably the leading reason why people will deploy a mesh. Depends on who you speak to. Sometimes it's just for encryption and to be able to handle that kind of a thing. But a lot of times it's for just sort of the very simplistically, like, signals. And so there's a fair bit to what Meshery aspires to do. So it's a management plane. So some of you are, I don't know, I'm trying to think how to be as concise as possible about some of this. It's a management plane. So it leans into service meshes quite specifically and in a fairly detailed way. It intends to help answer people's questions around performance specifically. Meshery is a sandbox project, but it's co-joined, if you will, by another sibling sandbox project, Service Mesh Performance. And so as people, just as a relevant but somewhat random example, as someone might use a service mesh to generate or to assist in the generation and propagation of distributed traces. And as it might facilitate sampling of those traces, like I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but the more that you sample, the more CPU cycles, the more disk space you might burn in, the more that you look at a thing, the more frequently, the more overhead that is. And so there's a lot of questions around overhead and understanding overhead and in context of the value being provided. That's a large part of what Service Mesh Performance as a project is. So these two projects, Meshery and Service Mesh Performance, one is a spec project, the other one is a capability. They interplay with Service Mesh Interface, SMI. SMI is focused on interoperability across service meshes, and so is Meshery. Meshery is also intends to help people who are not yet into meshy waters, but are just doing things with Kubernetes to help them visualize and comprehend. Even in this, like, so Matt was talking about kind of a different signal earlier than the three pillars that are often talked about. I don't know that this visualization that we're going to walk through is, I don't know that you couldn't necessarily consider it another signal, but keep that in the back of your mind as we go through Meshery. We'll see. So as a management plane, it aims to help people operate service meshes with confidence. Getting at those signals is and understanding which signals to watch. Like, so if they're looking at metrics, Meshery right now leans into metrics and logs more so than it does distributed traces. But some of the things that Meshery looks to do is to empower people with patterns and best practices. There is, an up and coming book on service mesh patterns. The patterns that are described inside that book are available to Meshery and importable by Meshery. So there's something of a service mesh catalog that's coming forth where users of Meshery will be able to take and apply these patterns. Maybe it's a best practice around circuit breaking or a best practice around what type of tail sampling to use or to configure the distributed tracing capability of a service mesh to use. There's this catalog is just in draft. And there are individual patterns, there are WebAssembly filters, at some point probably eBPF programs, again, with both observable, with monitoring use cases and then other use cases for those programs, those filters to apply in your infrastructure. Meshery helps people get those, configure them, and deploy them. Let me go into Meshery, poke around some of the interfaces, and do probably what's the worst job of introducing the project that I have to date. And so inside of, so one of the reasons I'm going to do a bad job is because half of my cluster is down. I'm having problems with the networking in my cluster. So one of the contributors to Meshery is on the call, and he's going to help me show the other part of what I'm missing. So we're missing some data in the dashboard that you would otherwise normally see here. One of the things that Meshery does by way of trying to help people get at maybe pre-existing dashboards or creating new dashboards, primarily from Grafana, and the metrics that they're pulling in from Prometheus, Meshery will discover the Kubernetes environment. It'll discover the service mesh environment. It'll provision service meshes or discover existing ones. It will allow people to import their existing Grafana boards. So let's go take a look at that. So in this environment, I'm just running a local Kubernetes instance on Docker desktop. Meshery is capable of connecting to multiple clusters. Users can go in and configure these metrics. And so to give an example of what I meant by connecting to Grafana, when Meshery connects to a Grafana instance, it will read in the boards that are predefined inside that instance. So in this case, this single node instance has got Istio running with the default kind of Grafana configuration for Istio. So the Istio project's predefined Grafana boards are here and available for people to come through, choose from, choose what metrics they'd want to show, and load them up into these boards, come through, and have, like in this case, there's two different boards loaded up. People, as they come through and analyze, there's most of the common things that you would expect for them to be able to do. In this case, it's polling, not Grafana. It just uses Grafana for the definition of what these boards are and what metrics to pull, but instead it's reaching directly to Prometheus. So in this sense, there's not necessarily a lot that's novel to this, I would say. A novel item is that users are able to add their own metrics that they'd like to monitor. And they do that by way of defining, using Grafana's board syntax. They're able to import the Grafana boards. That's great. The novelty that comes in probably by way of observability for Meshery has to do a bit with a visual topology called mesh map. There's two modes of mesh map. One mode is a designer mode in which you can visually, design and configure your like Kubernetes environment, or even more specifically, like your service mesh deployment. What Meshery will do is allow you to, Meshery has knowledge of each kind of any number of versions of a given service mesh that's been released. It lets you drag and drop your entities over. This is not going to make sense what I'm kind of drawing on the fly here, but basically do this type of design, come in, fill in the specifics about a given component and kind of visually configure it. In this case, if you were wanting to maybe apply a filter, you might want to drop that filter onto maybe your ingress gateway in this case and have a particular, maybe some additional signals generated So you could then see them in your in the charts that we were just looking at. To the extent that you wanted to maybe chain a couple of filters together, that you'd go through and configure, you'd select what filter it is that you wanted to run, what, if it was in a chain, what it was supposed to apply. This visual designing, this integrates with Git. You're able to save your designs, recall your designs, kind of go through and choose from either common WebAssembly filters. If you have pre-existing Kubernetes apps, then you can load those up here and retrieve them, pull them in to load them into the interface. In this particular case, this is a Kubernetes deployment. So that represents a little bit differently, to the extent that you might drag and drop particular components inside of a deployment. Anyway, so this is the part that's really frustrating, because this other mode of mesh map, this visual topology is a visualizer, which is much more of a read-only style, like visualization of your actively running infrastructure and looking at the telemetry and that kind of a thing. This is what's frustrating, is this is broken. This is like my environment's messed up. But Pranav, if you might be able to share. So Pranav is a Meshery contributor and works on a number of different components of Meshery. So the visualizer is to look like this. It's right now, kind of a color coding of the environment that you're running. So there's some objects in Kubernetes, some in the Meshery namespace, since he has Meshery deployed. If you were to maybe click on a pod and right click on a pod, indicate. And so Pranav, if you right click on a pod, we wanted to show folks how logging is being done. So yeah, if people are able to open up an interactive terminal against a pod. So actually, if you, Pranav, if you minimize this, but you right click on the rounded rectangle around, yeah, there you go. Yep. So it's a little, this needs to be updated, not on the octagon, but the rounded rectangle that's around. Yes, that, yeah, there you go. So that's the pod. Yep. And if you initiate connection there, what'll end up happening is that for any containers that are inside that pod, an SSH set or a terminal session will be established. But the same thing goes for logs. So if people want to quickly initiate a logging or a log stream, they could right click on that. If you choose maybe a different pod, Pranav, and right click and do log streaming instead. The concept here is that people will be able to readily apply filters. They can do, there's a magnifying glass in here to kind of quickly search through the logs to find what they need to look for. Or the Meshery doesn't have it yet, but sort of predefined filters that people, things that you're looking to search for in advance. And so I'm going to, Pranav, actually, if I'm going to reshare a couple of other aspects of Meshery, but I'm going to stop talking so people can ask questions. There's kind of a lot to Meshery. We didn't talk about the performance management that it does, the load generation that it does, the statistical analysis that it does to help people understand the behavior of their environment.
I have a quick germane question, maybe a prompt. Could you just briefly either pull up the doc page or talk to the service meshes that currently have adapters for Meshery? Meshery is not a new project, and there are a number of integrations that kind of make this immediately useful out of the box.
Yeah, good, great question. So Meshery is an extensible platform. So some of the things that we were just showing are plugins or are areas of configurability for Meshery. And one of those areas, one of the prominent things is this concept of adapters. And so Meshery has an adapter for each of the following service meshes. Actually, this one needs to be promoted and this one needs to be demoted. But so there's about 10 in total. I think this lists 11, this one that needs to be demoted needs to go away. So we'd have about 10. So Cilium service mesh, I think is in beta. There's a couple of folks from Isovalent that we've been working with to make sure that the adapter best represents the capabilities of each mesh. Some of you might be asking, wait a second, like, wait. So if you're familiar with SMI, service mesh interface, it has a set of currently 4, but maybe a 5th API specification that defines kind of a lowest common denominator set of API interfaces, which is to help people or tools interact with service meshes in a uniform way. That's kind of at the core of what SMI's value proposition is, and it's quite helpful. Meshery is quite close to the SMI project. It also takes a divergent approach in terms of trying to providing an adapter for each service mesh. And in doing so, ensuring that each service mesh's differentiated functionality is raw and available to Meshery users. So there's no neutering of any of the service mesh's functionality. All of their capabilities are exposed, and that's why there's a specific adapter for each. Henrik, I thought you were going to ask a question, but it might not. You might not have been. So there, the other. So yeah, there's a couple of There's a couple of ho-hum aspects maybe to Meshery, and some that have a lot of utility to people around performance monitor or performance management by way of testing. So this is kind of a global view of the tests that have been run, performance tests. So load that's been generated against an active environment, and then statistical analysis that's been run or done in evaluation of that load. And so the P50, P75, P90, P99, these things are calculated for a duration. So when someone runs a performance test, they choose an endpoint, they choose a particular configuration of a service mesh, and Meshery will run that. And this helps people both compare against one another, compare against different meshes, compare what their performance is with or without a mesh, and then also just compare ongoing in their environment. They kind of create their own baseline, and then in an ongoing way, they end up tracking and comparing their performance over time. So let me see if I can show kind of a quick comparison just randomly. So if 2 different tests have been run, you can come in and choose between those 2 and choose to compare. So I don't know the particulars of the environment change. Maybe there weren't any environmental changes, but people, you can come through and kind of try out one configuration, see which one performs better for you. And so you can see this ties into that service mesh performance spec, which is trying to define kind of just a uniform way in which these types of analysis are done, these types of performance benchmarking is done. So these 2, there's a couple. Yeah, go ahead, Hendrik.
It's just a small question. So how, what is the run test? What is it? Is like you're referring to like a job that is in a cluster that you trigger, or how does it?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Okay.
So yeah, he actually will create a new one which is. The concept here is that if you're running a mesh, Meshery will identify that one, kind of make it easier to pick out that you'd go, point the test against your locally running or your remotely running service endpoint that's on or off of the mesh. Right now, Meshery will, yes, is the answer to your question, by the way. Like for the run test, it's like Meshery itself has 3 different types of load generators built in. So FortDO, WRK2, and Nighthawk. They each behave like, to most, maybe they don't care. They behave a little bit differently, or they do their analysis a little bit differently. Some of them start counting at different points. Let's see if this works. It basically, I would have clicked run test on one of those other profiles, it would have invoked whatever was configured for that profile. And so in this case, it's like a 15-second test using FortDO as the generator to generate HTTP requests in this case.
Are you planning to include other testing? Because a lot of people are using Locust or K6 or other platform that has been designed for heavy load test and benchmark. Are you planning to have a compatibility with other tools than the one that you have at the moment?
The project is totally open to it. We looked at Vegeta some long time back and just didn't get the warmest of feelings from that particular community. But there's a desire to, what has happened over the last year-ish or so is that contributors within the Meshery community have been leaning into Nighthawk as a load generation tool. And there's kind of two interesting upcoming capabilities that Meshery is going to do around Nighthawk. And that is to orchestrate multiple instances of Nighthawk as a load generator and kind of distribute that load generator across your cluster or your clusters. So you can do distributed performance testing and kind of distributed analysis and have the statistical analysis come, data sync back centrally and then kind of coalesce so you can look at it. That's one thing. The second thing that the community is doing around Nighthawk is these adaptive load tests, which is to say, let people run an optimization algorithm more or less, which is to like, if you have the question of something like, hey, I'd like to make my service mesh deployment or my application infrastructure as resilient as possible, knowing that the network fails occasionally, I'll go ahead and configure some retries. So I've got 10 services. I'll put on 1 retry per service. Or maybe I should put on 20 retries per service. Like where's the right line? Where's the balance in accordance with your predefined SLOs or how much overhead, or what any number of variables in your environment about what would be the right number of retries to configure on a per. And so the second aspect of what the community is doing around Nighthawk is to allow people to define, it doesn't have it right now, but to define some of those, to basically define an optimization algorithm to plug in what's your maximum tolerant latency that you're willing to accept, and then sort of basically what's the slowest performance that you're willing to accept in context of the highest resilience that can be configured. And it'll run recursively on a set of load tests, one on top of the next, taking into account the output of the first into the next, and then it just help you programmatically figure out what your optimal retry count is per service based on.
It would be cool to have also the ability to do like Argo or like a workflow where you run a test, and in the middle of the tests, you start changing your retry logic or anything, and then you measure so then you have during the overall test results, you can see those specific events and what was the impact in terms of for the user. It will be great.
Totally. Hendrik, it's like you're speaking to the roadmap, because Meshery is almost at its v0.6 release. And before it gets to v1.0, there's like 2 major architectural components to come forth. One of them is a workflow engine. And that's a great example of how someone would use the workflow engine that we're looking at or have been for a long time is temporal. The second architectural component is a policy engine. So something like OPA or Caverna or something, because to your point, like not only would they maybe want to change something based on, have a workflow in there to change it, but they also might want to have a policy that does an evaluation to say, and then, so. Yeah. the appetite in the roadmap is maybe larger than the number of fingers that are on the project, but this, at least this is giving you all some sense of what Meshery does in a non-sexier way. It also is the conformance tool for service mesh interface. So for the service meshes that say that they implement SMI, there's a suite of tests that Meshery will, Meshery will deploy the service mesh and then invoke those tests to kind of assert whether or not they're in compliance with service mesh interface. I'll say that there's an upcoming announcement at, there's some stuff we just kind of didn't cover, but like to the extent that Meshery has these different service meshes loaded up, that while we were doing that configuration of your mesh earlier to a visual interface, you could do so kind of in building out, kind of watch as you build out your own, long set of YAML. And then you can save these off. And so one of the things that that the community has been working toward is an announcement at DockerCon about a Docker extension for Meshery. So Meshery will deploy as kind of a first-class citizen of Docker Desktop, which will hopefully be useful to those that are maybe wanting to, like under the load generation use case, like generate load from their local system, or maybe against their remote cluster or their local cluster. The other thought here is that those that are, working on microservices or developing against, developing Kubernetes-based applications, over time as service meshes become ubiquitous, that they would be able to, use the combination of Meshery and Docker Desktop to have kind of a checkbox for a local Kubernetes deployment or a local service mesh deployment, and then go play and figure out what the right configuration is based on their app, whether or not they should build retries into their app or use the ones from the mesh or whatever that is. I'll stop there. We wanted to, I don't know, like, well, Hendrik's thoughts, those are most welcome, those suggestions about, and like the specific mention of K6 and the other one, and Locust. Part of our challenge, by the way, for Fortio, WRK2, and Nighthawk for Meshery is written in Golang. Fortio is written in Golang as well, and so the integration there is quite, there's no bugs. Like it's consistent. The other two are written in C++, and there's just some rigmarole around. Those are just harder for Meshery to support. It does, and it's building more into in and around Nighthawk. But Locust, do you recall, is that Python by chance?
I have no idea. I think it's Node.js or Go, something. I don't remember, to be honest. But K6 has the advantage because you have the Prometheus support, that it will push the entire statistics of K6 to Prometheus using remote writer feature.
Nice.
And it has also a feature that you can embed in a customized image of K6 that has the plugin called X distributed tracing. And what it does, it's going to start the first span or the first trace. At the end, you will have an end-to-end trace coming from the load emitters, and then you can follow up. So I think in terms of the user, I think in terms of analysis and it makes a lot of sense.
Totally. Yeah, it does.
So we're coming up on the top of the hour, and whenever anybody comes to Tag to present something like this and say, hey, here's this cool thing, I almost always ask the same question, which is, how can people engage with the Meshery project? How can they contribute? It sounds like new ideas or additional future features you're open to that as a project. But if you could talk briefly about where can folks find more, how can they engage, and if people want to contribute, where should they start?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, Pranav is a great example. Pranav and I did not plan this. He just showed up to the meeting. He's contributing to Meshery. He had it running. He could show it. he's a great example of there's a very healthy community around Meshery. Maybe it's too open to change because there is a lot that is desired to be done in the project. If you hit meshery.io, there's links to Slack and to there's meetings almost every day of the week for the various things that are going on. Jump in. You'll find a warm reception. And yeah, there's a channel in the CNCF Slack as well.
Yeah, I can also say I put a link to the Meshery overview deck into the meeting notes as well. Lee's got a tall order here in terms of summarizing what Meshery is in 20 minutes or less. But the project is quite broad and deep, and there's a lot of content there, both on Meshery and one of the contributing entities, Layer 5. I encourage you all to give it a look, and happy to continue this discussion either async over Slack, or we can spin up some sideways meetings, on this or anything else. We have we have a lot of latitude to self-organize, right? So I encourage anyone who's interested in Meshery to reach out to Lee or to the project directly. Are there any other questions before the CNCF's Zoom account cuts us off? We're at +2 minutes here, so we're on borrowed time as is. Okay.
Thanks so much for this, guys. It's great questions as well.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. That's it for today. The video will be posted shortly later today, after I clean out the dead air in the beginning of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Lee.
Bye all.
So let's jump into directly to the latest.